Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones, shut off your cell phones, shut off timers and alarms. My name is Salvatore Scabona. I'm the Weinberg Director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. I appreciate your coming out tonight for the second of the 2024 Joanna Jackson Goldman Memorial Lectures on American Civilization and Government, given this year by Jon Meacham. As many of you were here last night, I won't rehash much of this introduction except to encourage you to come back for our October 15th conversation with Francis Jeter and Peter Cooper about Francis's new book, Amalgam, and on November 19th for Hernan Diaz and Jean Strauss's conversation about her forthcoming book, Family Romance. This event is being recorded and will later be posted on the library's channel on YouTube. Jon Meacham will again speak for about 40 minutes. Then we'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will walk along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. Copies of some of Jon Meacham's books, his recent books, are for sale in the hall, and he's agreed to sign your copy after the lecture. Now please help me welcome Jon Meacham.
Thank you. You are the faithful remnant. There's a great line in Tom Sawyer where an evangelist came to town who was so good that Tom Sawyer said even Huck Finn was saved until Tuesday. So my goal is to keep you all saved till Thursday. Let's begin with a reminder. When I speak of civic patriotism, I mean the allegiance of a people to a state devoted to human liberty, dignity, representative government, and equality before the law. And when I speak of ethnic nationalism, I mean the impulse of a people to extend rights and to protect and pursue the interests only of a particular group whose members share, for instance, a place of birth, language, religious affiliation, or characteristics associated with racial categories and hierarchies. For our purposes, civic patriotism emphasizes possibility and pluralism. Ethnic nationalism values stasis and homogeneity. Civic patriotism tends to be inclusive. Ethnic nationalism tends to be exclusive. Civic patriotism grows out of, and rightly practiced, is supportive of the democratic tradition embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Ethnic nationalism has more in common with autocratic movements that seek to supplant a liberal ethos with the rule of the one, be it one man or one group. This is a rough typology, but I believe there is utility even in such rough forms. Last night, we discussed the evolving understandings and applications of these large terms from the roots of the American Revolution through the Civil War. Tonight, I propose a few thoughts on how the contest between civic patriotism and ethnic nationalism has shaped our more recent past. My hope in so doing is that we might find our way to using this typology as a means of judging not only what has been, but what is and what might be. For our purposes, nation and nationalism are different things. Nation tends to connote a polity of people, usually in a defined territorial space, who are in community with one another. Nationalism, however, again for our purposes, includes the conviction that people can be categorized and then favored or disfavored depending on that category. At least since the late 18th century, nation has been a largely neutral term, a synonym for country. Nationalism, in the context in which we're speaking, is not a neutral term, for it features an exclusionary quality over the more inclusive nature of patriotism. And let's be very clear. Ethnic nationalism prevailed in what became the United States for centuries. It was an assignment of power and of rights based not on ideas of equality, but on race and ethnicity. And now for a case study. In 1948, when Hubert Humphrey, then the mayor of Minneapolis, called on the Democratic National Convention to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the sunshine of human rights, and civil rights. Supporters of Strom Thurmond and his segregationist worldview marched out of the convention, went south, and met at Birmingham, Alabama to form the Dixiecrat ticket. Worried about communists and civil rights, President Truman had integrated the military the same month of the Dixiecrat rebellion. The disaffected began to carry Confederate battle flags to rallies, seeking to link their cause with the lost one. That was actually the first time in Southern history where the battle flag was mass-produced, was in 1948. After the school integration rulings of 1954 and 1955, defiance grew. Impeach Earl Warren signs appeared across the South. Georgia incorporated the Confederate battle emblem into its flag in 1956. South Carolina hoisted the Confederate colors over its capital in 1962. In the wake of the school integration decisions, Robert Penn Warren, novelist, poet, critic, professor, Vanderbilt graduate, those are not in ascending order. Descending order, sorry. Accepted an assignment from Life magazine to travel to his native South. Enraged white Southerners were carrying signs that read, "Keep our schools white." There was suspicion, with all respect, of the New York press, with one resident of the old Confederacy telling Warren, "Well, by God, it's just a fact. It's not in them not to load the dice in a news story." And there was the making of common cause with neo-Nazis and anti-Semites. One segregationist mused to Warren about Gerald L.K. Smith, a prominent white nationalist. "Lord," he said, "that man's mailing list must be worth $1 million." Warren mused about the path forward, writing, "We have to deal with the problem our historical moment proposes, the burden of our time. We all live with 1,000 unsolved problems of justice all the time. All we can do for posterity is to try to plug along in a way to make them think we, the old folks, did the best we could for justice as we could understand it." By the early 1960s, a reckoning was at hand. Born in 1919, a native of Barber County, Alabama, George Corley Wallace had not always been a race baiter. Just after World War II, as a young man, Wallace expressed progressive thoughts, telling a Sunday school teacher at his church, "You know, we just can't keep the colored folks down like we've been doing around here for years and years. We got to quit. We got to start treating them right. They just like everybody else." Wallace veered between hardline segregation and a more moderate stance for the next decade or so. In 1948, the year of the Humphrey speech and the Dixiecrat Rebellion, he had sought election as an alternate delegate to that Democratic National Convention with the slogan, "Unalterably opposed to the nomination of Harry S. Truman and the so-called Civil Rights Program." Yet in 1958, in a race for governor against fellow Democrat John Patterson, Wallace wandered back over toward the center while Patterson ran right. Never again. Wallace lost and pledged that would not happen. An old political associate recalled the post-1958 transformation. Wallace, the man said, used to be anything but a racist, but with all his chattering, he managed to talk himself into it. Elected governor in 1962, he was inaugurated at the state capitol on Monday, January 14th, 1963. He stood on the spot where Jefferson Davis had taken the oath as President of the Confederate States of America. If he looked up and left, he could see Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the parish of Martin Luther King Jr. Alluding to Davis's hour upon that same stage, Wallace said, "It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The crowd erupted. Wallace took a moment to wipe his nose in the winter cold, and then he plunged on. This nation was never meant to be a unit of one, and so it is also in our racial lives. If we amalgamate into the one unit as advocated by the communist philosophers, then we become a mongrel unit of one under a single all-powerful government, and we stand for everything and for nothing. Wallace brought something intriguing to the modern politics of fear in America: a visceral connection to crowds, an appeal that confounded elites, but which gave him a durable base. The cigar-chewing figure with slicked-back hair, he privately envied Robert Kennedy's tousled look, was, a female journalist told the writer Marshall Frady, simply more alive than all the others. Alluding to a Wallace speech in New Hampshire, the woman continued, "You saw those people in that auditorium when he was speaking. You saw their eyes. He made those people feel something real for once in their lives. You can't help but respond to him. Me, my heart was pounding. I couldn't take my eyes off him. There were all these people screaming. You almost love him, though you know what a little gremlin he is." Wallace provoked devotion and rage. Many adored him, revering him as a savior. Many others despaired of a future under his rule. Educated people in Alabama were said to be reading books about Nazi Germany, particularly William R. Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, searching for parallels in 1963. In Wallace, the lost cause and white ethnic nationalism found new relevance. In the months after that gubernatorial inauguration, the crisis came. A federal court ordered the integration of the University of Alabama. Wallace had pledged to stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent just such a thing, and he thrilled to the hour. So ran the line from the polemics of pro-slavery white Southerners to the politics of George Wallace, a line connecting the Civil War to the Cold War, the 1860s to the 1960s, a distant America to a more contemporary one. The federal government was the villain, states' rights were the salvation of the founders' vision, white supremacy was to be protected. And yet, Wallace failed. Civic patriotism prevailed. The Kennedy Justice Department enforced the court order in Tuscaloosa. The university was integrated. On the evening of the day the federal officials forced Wallace to stand aside, President Kennedy spoke to the nation. It was June 11th, 1963. The president said, "Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish to have his children to be treated. But this is not the case." Kennedy's language was straightforward, his tone reasonable. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. It is an elegant formulation, probably the most quoted line from that address. But Kennedy continued to speak in concrete terms, making the issue as tangible and as little abstract as he could. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we wish to be treated. So said John Kennedy. Kennedy carried the day against Wallace, but it was just that, the day, and Wallace was forced to step aside at Tuscaloosa. Parenthetically, on that same day, June 11th, 1963, which began with Wallace in the schoolhouse door, the middle of the evening, Kennedy addresses the nation. His teleprompter went out about 2/3 the way through the speech, by the way. He improvised the last third. If you watch the tape, you can see a look of panic in his eyes, and you can hear several people thinking about what their next career is going to be in the background. But just after midnight that night, in Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers was shot to death in his driveway, the field secretary of the NAACP. Claude Sitton of the New York Times wrote one of the great deadline pieces of journalism describing the path of the bullet that came into the kitchen, one of the bullets, and ended up between a coffee maker and a watermelon. A day that gives us the sweep. The showdown in Tuscaloosa helped push Kennedy to introduce a wide-ranging civil rights bill, the legislation that was still pending when the president was killed in Dallas that November. Now, you'll see what I'm doing here, and it's fraught. I admit that. I am suggesting that one policy path be characterized as patriotic, Kennedy's, which in the hurly-burly of the arena can be reduced to a Manichaean frame in which those who wish to follow a different path, Wallace, resent being seen as unpatriotic, and those who seek the patriotic resolution are vulnerable to self-righteousness and a lack of self-criticism. I'm sure not you all, but other people. I stipulate the difficulties, I admit the dangers, but I ask you, am I wrong? I don't think so. I wouldn't. It's a little like the preacher who one day in the pulpit said, "As our Lord said, and rightly." I always love that. Our highest loyalty is not to people who look like us or worship like us or come from the same places. Our highest loyalty is to the principles that drove the revolution, even if imperfectly realized. And the best defense against self-righteousness is an insistent humility about our own virtues. Because the patriotic allegiance to principle ought not to be understood as personal virtue, but as a civic one. And the civic creed must always include a simultaneous commitment to respect the viewpoint of others. Their vote counts as much as yours does. Victory comes from prevailing within the mechanics of the polity, not in disenfranchising one's opponents, either literally or figuratively. So the work of patriotism is in part persuasion. To continue with the story, after Dallas on that Friday, November 22nd, 1963, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, was in bed at his house in Spring Valley in Washington. He was giving orders to his staff. There was so much to do, a funeral to plan, calls to world leaders. And Johnson said, "I'm going to pass the Civil Rights Bill, and I'm not going to change a jot or a tittle." And the staff said, "Yeah." The 1964 election was a year away. The reason Kennedy and Johnson were in Texas, by the way, was because Texas was in play. Lyndon Johnson's seat had been taken when he went from the vice presidency to the Senate in a special election by John Tower, the first Republican to be in the Senate since Reconstruction from Texas. The state was moving to the right. The reason the president and the vice president were there was to shore up support as 1964 began. When the staff pushed back, Johnson looked at them and said, "Well, what the hell is the presidency for, if not to do the things that other men might not?" James Rowe, an old FDR hand, used to tell the story about the difference between Kennedy as president and Johnson as president. A senator would come to Kennedy and say, "I'd love to go along with you, Mr. President, but it would give me serious trouble back home." Kennedy would always say, "I understand." Rowe said, now Johnson knew damn well the senator was going to tell him that, and he never let the senator get to the point of his troubles back home. He would tell him about the flag and about God and the story of the country, and he'd get them by the lapels, and they were out the door. That's why he got so much done so fast. The flag, God, the story of the country. Those were Johnson's means, and they can be ours. They should be ours. President Johnson passed the Civil Rights Bill after a 71-day filibuster and signed it in July 1964. He was thrilled, but he knew it was a battle, not the war. He told the Justice Department, "I want you to write me the goddamnedest, toughest Voting Rights Act that you can devise." On the 1964 bill, Johnson had risen to the occasion created by voices of protest. He had, in fact, surpassed the occasion, and he knew that he and his party would pay a price. "It is an important gain," Johnson told Bill Moyers after signing the civil rights law, "but I think we just delivered the South to the Republicans for a long time to come." Truer words, rarely spoken. Now, voting rights were top of mind. The flashpoint in 1965 was Selma, Alabama, the seat of Dallas County. On Sunday, March 7th, 1965, the March for voting rights had barely begun when Alabama state troopers charged nonviolent demonstrators. Trapped between asphalt and his uniformed attackers at the foot of the bridge, named for the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, inhaling tear gas and reeling from billy club blows to his head, John Robert Lewis, then 25 years old, felt everything dimming. He could hear screams and slurs and the clop, clop, clop of the troopers' horses. His skull fractured, his vision blurred. John Lewis believed the end had come. He said to himself, "People are going to die here. I'm going to die here." Yet for him, there was strangely no sense of panic, no gasping, no thrashing, no fear. He was at peace. I asked him in the last weeks of his life what he dreamed about. It's a biographical trick. I ask people, what's your first memory and what do you dream about? His first memory, wonderfully, was of his mother's garden, which begins the biblical drama of John Lewis's life, because we all began in a garden. And I will be honest with you, when I ask about what Congressman Lewis dreamt about, it's not that I was hoping, that's not the right word, but I thought it might be nightmares. He was arrested 41 times. He spent time in Parchman, which Faulkner called the Mississippi State Prison in Sunflower County, 20,000 acres. Faulkner called Parchman Destination Doom. If you think about it, Congressman Lewis was in far more danger when we couldn't see him than when we could. And as ever, St. John Robert Lewis defied expectations. He dreamt, he said, of the light, of the sound of the feet marching, and of the songs they sang. He dreamt of the light, not the dark. The world around him on that day, Bloody Sunday, was at war, even if he was at peace, and the television cameras were whirring. Images of the Alabama troopers' attack on Lewis and his fellow marchers ran that evening. ABC broke into the broadcast premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg to show the footage. The irony and the coincidence and the parallels were lost on few. What had begun as an ordinary day in a small southern town was soon to be known as Bloody Sunday, and the scene at the bridge became that rarest of things, a crossroads in the long story of civilization. If you haven't been to the Pettus Bridge, go. Who's been there? It's amazingly steep. It's not, they felt trapped. They're high above the Alabama River. As images from Selma spread around the nation, Johnson knew he needed to act. But he was careful. He invited Wallace to the White House for a meeting. We alluded to this last night. It was a classic LBJ encounter, what was known as a nostril inspection. The president seated Wallace on the couch in the Oval Office and then positioned himself in a taller rocking chair, dominating the smaller man. Johnson asked, "George, why are you doing this? You came into office a liberal. You spent all your life trying to do things for the poor. Now, why are you working on this? Why are you off on this Negro thing? You ought to be down there calling for help for Aunt Susie in the nursing home. Now listen, George, don't think about 1968. Think about 1988. You and me, we'll be dead and gone then, George. What do you want left after you when you die? Do you want a great big marble monument that reads, George Wallace he built? Or do you want a little piece of pine board lying across that harsh soil down there that reads, George Wallace he hated? Wallace was defeated. Hell, if I'd stayed there and much longer, the governor remarked, he'd have had me coming out for civil rights and Martin Luther King. The marchers would be protected. The President of the United States had prevailed. And for our purposes, civic patriotism had prevailed. Which brings us to this proposition. What if we looked at each significant question in the life of the country and asked ourselves, what is the ethnic nationalist response to this? What is the civically patriotic response to this? And then what if we were guided by trying to act not nationalistically, but patriotically? Put another way, what if we decided what to do in the present with an eye toward what the future might think of us? Is there anyone alive who would admit that they would have preferred with all their heart to have been on the Pettus Bridge marching for justice on that March day in 1965, rather than standing at its foot, armed against the right and the good? Not every issue is so stark, but some issues are. In times of particularly upsetting change, like the post-World War II era, and like our own, many take refuge in ethnic nationalism. The familiar is comforting. This is not to say that the new and the untried are intrinsically good or necessarily desirable. It is to say, however, that the history of our country tends to the commonly agreed upon better when we respond affirmatively to the dictates of conscience, to that moral sensibility that suggests the rightness of a given course over and against another course. And I'm proposing that there is a patriotic element in heeding the importunings of conscience. Now, a word about immigration. Anxiety about refugees and immigrants and the related desire of presidents and peoples to quell that unease are nearly as old as the Republic. Americans have often limited immigration in moments of fear, only to have those fears largely dissipate. In 1798, John Adams, amid talk of war with France, signed the Alien and Sedition Acts to, in his view, protect the national interest against internal dissent and outside agitation. Passed by a Federalist-controlled Congress, the laws, among other things, increased the number of years applicants for citizenship had to wait and authorized the president to deport any foreigner he deemed dangerous to the country. Writing to Thomas Jefferson that year, James Madison said, "The alien bill proposed in the Senate is a monster that must forever disgrace its parents." And Madison was right. In the long run, Adams's legacy has been tarnished by this grab for power. We are here on a September night in 2024 discussing what John Adams did in 1798. Do you think if John Adams had it to do over again, he would have done something different to avoid this conversation? If he could have just had McCulloch, it would have been fine. In the short term, didn't even work out then, the acts gave new force to Adams's opposition, led by Jefferson and Madison, who went on to defeat the Federalists in 1800, making Adams the first one-term president in American history. It all happened again in the mid-19th century, when the Know-Nothings sprang up in reaction to a wave of European immigration in the wake of the revolutions in Europe in 1848. It happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act under Chester Arthur. You haven't had Chester Arthur thrown at you in a long time. It happened with anarchists under Theodore Roosevelt, with punitive immigration quotas after the Bolshevik Revolution through the 20s and 30s, a period of America first, and with refugees from the communist bloc in the early 1950s. Now, in 1783, George Washington articulated what we like to think of as the American Creed. He wrote, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and the respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions." Yet, fears about indiscriminate immigration are coeval with the nation's founding and the early republic. In 1802, even the now sainted Alexander Hamilton. I'm a Jefferson biographer. If any of you have any rap lyrics, I'll be here afterward. I got to tell you, my favorites. This had nothing to do with what we're talking about. So when I was out talking about my beloved former colleague from Newsweek, who's just turned 80 years old, Barbara DiVittorio is here. I would not be here without her. So if you don't like it, blame her. When we were working together, I had just published a book on Jefferson. And I got a call from Chris Christie. And he said, "I'd like to talk to you about Jeff. Come talk to me." And you do what he says. So I went to Trenton, and we were having lunch, and he said, "You know, I'm really more of a Hamilton guy." And I said, "Well, that's great, Governor, but at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey." And the damnedest thing happened. I couldn't get back into the city. I spent months on this. That's all you're going to remember. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's an old preacher's trick. Make sure you give them one thing to remember. Hamilton said this: "The influx of foreigners must tend to produce a heterogeneous compound, to change and corrupt the national spirit, to complicate and confound public opinion, to introduce foreign propensities." We've never been, you and I, we've never been as open as we'd like to think. But at our best, we have managed to remain truer to the spirit that Washington expressed than to the one Hamilton did there. That's the American paradox, one that continues unabated. An example from the Cold War, another moment of rising international tensions and domestic fears, is worth remembering as well. In 1952, President Truman vetoed a bill, Congress overrode it and passed it anyway, that perpetuated the quota system from the isolationist 1920s. To Congress, Truman wrote, "Today we are protecting ourselves, as we were in 1924, against being flooded by immigrants. This is fantastic," meaning crazy. "The countries of Eastern Europe have fallen under the communist yoke. They are silenced, fenced off by barbed wire and minefields. No one passes their borders but at the risk of his life. We do not need to be protected against immigrants from these countries. On the contrary, we should want to stretch out a helping hand to those who are brave enough to escape from barbarism." Truman was calling on our better selves. We did not answer. But one of the great things about America is that redemption is always possible, at least thus far. The end of the restrictive quota system, which, by the way, that system from 1924 was what was in place and was cited by the State Department and by President Roosevelt in declining to accept more refugees from the Third Reich. That was the controlling legislation. The end of that system did not come until 1965, when President Johnson, down in the harbor here, signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, a key piece of legislation that, together with the Voting Rights Act, makes 1965 a year of remarkable civic patriotism. As ever, of course, action provoked reaction, and we're living in the long shadow of ethnic nationalist sentiment about immigration, and more viscerally, about immigrants. One need not favor an open border to see that the lies about, say, the death of household pets in Springfield, Ohio, are designed to put one's kind ahead of one's creed. And that's what this season of American politics is about. Kind versus creed. Ethnic nationalism versus civic patriotism. Rage versus grace. Autocracy versus democracy. And let's consider that 1965, in fact, marks the beginning, the founding of the United States of America as a multiracial democracy. In my world, and in yours too, if you're here, we talk about 1619 or 1776. It was neither. It's 1965. The first time my region decided to actually enfranchise under the terms of the 15th Amendment. I'd like to end our time together by noting how two crazy radicals, Dwight David Eisenhower and George Herbert Walker Bush, saw our country. I choose them because in their day, and in some quarter since, they've been dismissed and derided by adherents of American liberalism as men of a status quo, as stumbling blocks to progress, as fatally compromised embodiments of white privilege. I'm sure no one in this zip code has ever said that. And yet they were men of parts. And a key element of our way forward will be a Republican Party where men, such men, are honored and heeded. Eisenhower defined patriotism as, quote, just that sense of loyalty and obligation to the community that is necessary to the preservation of all the privileges and rights that the community guarantees. As a cadet at West Point from 1911 to 1915, Eisenhower had been taught the British statesman James Bryce's description of patriotism as, quote, A, an intelligent knowledge of what is best for one's country as a whole. B, the placing of the country's interest above party, class, sectional, or selfish interest. C, the willingness to serve and to sacrifice for the welfare of one's country. In 1989, over beers in the White House with Newt Gingrich and Vin Weber, the Minnesota congressman who'd managed Gingrich's internal House leadership campaign, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, seemed not to be saying what was on his mind. This was one of those moments, by the way, like the wing of a butterfly. The reason the Republicans one of the reasons the Republicans have taken the path they took was because of the defeat of John Tower to be the Secretary of Defense in 1989. Follow the bouncing ball. Tower, Republican senator, whom we mentioned earlier. This is the only time he's been mentioned twice, ever. Senator Tower is nominated by George H.W. Bush to be the Secretary of Defense. The Senate discovered suddenly that there was drinking and perhaps other extracurricular activities abroad in the Senate. They were shocked to find gambling in the casino. Tower is defeated on a vote by his former colleagues, first time in hundreds of years. Bush needed a Secretary of Defense right then. He needed someone who could be confirmed that afternoon. So he reached out to a congressman from Wyoming named Dick Cheney. He pulls Cheney, who is the House whip, the Republican whip, out of the House leadership, which opened a slot on the House leadership ladder that Gingrich won. I danced with a man who danced with a woman who danced with the Prince of Wales. Bush invites Gingrich and Van Weber, who told me the story generously, down to the White House. He's lovely, he's gracious, of course, but they can tell there's something he's not saying. So Weber turns to him and says, "Mr. President, you've been very nice to us. Tell us what your biggest fear is about us." And Bush is relieved to have a chance to do this and jumps right in. And he says, "Well, I'm worried that sometimes your idealism will get in the way of what I think of as sound governance." I'm going to say that again. I'm worried that sometimes your idealism will get in the way of what I think of is sound governance. In a single sentence, President Bush had encapsulated a great truth. Gingrich and his team believed so deeply in adherence to a conservative orthodoxy that compromise, which Bush saw as essential to what he called sound governance, was out of the question. I was President Bush's biographer, and by the time I published the book in 2015, he had a form of Parkinson's, and so he couldn't hold a book, and it was not short. The first draft was 1,000 pages. I mentioned it to Barbara. She said, "I wouldn't read 1,000 pages about George." So that's market testing. Okay, when the wife won't read it, let's trim. But he was having staff and visitors read from the biography to him. And they called and said, "Do you want to come up and read if you're going to be in," it was in Maine. I said, "That'd be fabulous. I mean, an unprecedented moment. Most of my subjects are dead. And when I read to them, it's like C-SPAN meets The Shining. You don't want that." So I was delighted. I sat for an hour with the 41st President of the United States, reading my words about his life. He was like this the whole time. Didn't react, except once. It was the chapter where that scene I just shared with you was published. I mentioned Gingrich. And the only time the old man did anything was he said, "Oh, Jesus, Newt." That was it. 3 powerful words. "Oh, Jesus, Newt." Now, the 41st president was no saint, but he was never fully at home with the conservative base of his own party. As a Senate candidate in Texas in 1964, he had opposed the Civil Rights Act. As a presidential candidate in 1988, his campaign benefited from racist imagery in an independent expenditure group's ad targeting a convicted criminal who had raped and killed on a furlough from a Massachusetts prison under his opponent, Governor Dukakis. And when Bush pledged no new taxes in 1988, he didn't really mean it. He saw campaigns as fields for what he called, in a phrase from Mao, the empty cannons of rhetoric. And so when he did raise taxes in 1990, he was surprised at the ferocity of the reaction from the right wing and in the emerging world of right-wing media. The end of the fairness doctrine in the Reagan administration had given figures such as Rush Limbaugh an opening on AM radio to launch daily, even hourly attacks on the Washington consensus that Bush embodied. He was seen as a moderate Trojan horse by the right. Its reaction to the Bush presidency, which was also, I believe, a delayed reaction to much of the substance of the Reagan years, fueled the journey ever farther away from civic patriotism into a jagged landscape of ethnic nationalism. Bush 41 had seen this up close. In 1988, in Kingsport, Tennessee, a hardcore right-winger, a supporter of the evangelical Pat Robertson, had refused to shake the then vice president's hand. In his diary, which he kept an audio diary, Bush said this staring, glaring ugliness, there's something terrible about those who carry it to extremes. They're scary. They're there for spooky, extraordinary, right-winged reasons. They don't care about party. They don't care about anything. They're the excesses. They could be Nazis. They could be communists. They could be whatever. They will destroy this party if they're allowed to take over. The lights go out and they pass out the ugly literature, nastiness, ugliness, believing the conspiracy theories. So said George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988. Taken all in all, the Republican presidents of the post-World War II era, Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and the Bushes, were civic patriots, not ethnic nationalists. That's among the reasons that not a single one of them, not a single one, could plausibly have been nominated by the Republican Party in 2024. That's a problem not only for Republicans, but for everyone. For the constitutional order depends on having two functional parties. So how did this happen? I believe there was a broad consensus in terms of governance and politics that ran from 1933 until 2017. It's best understood, I would submit, as a figurative conversation between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. Reagan's over here, FDR's over here. Every American president, from Roosevelt through Obama, and now President Biden, was on that spectrum. There were two central questions. One was the relative role of the state in the marketplace, about which we can disagree. The second was the relative projection of force against commonly agreed upon foes and rivals. You might not want to send troops to confront communism, but you're not for communism. That was the nature of the debate. There was a certain set of principles that were commonly agreed upon. That conversation was broken in 2017, and President Biden's mission has been to restore that conversation since. I do not want to suggest that that conversation was commensurate with all the problems of the world and of the country. It was not. But I think it's an interesting typology and another means by which one might judge whether someone fits into a frame of coherence as opposed to a frame in which ambition seems to dominate everything else. Civic patriotism can risk becoming a source of justification for any course of action. We have to manage it and marshal it well. In religious terms, it risks turning into an object of idolatry, which the nation already is in the view of many Christian nationalists who wish to see the country as a sectarian undertaking. So what to do? Predictably, I believe history can illuminate a path forward, and American history suggests that civic patriotism is an appealing and proven source of light. To be patriotic in the sense we've been discussing requires a citizen to bear several thoughts in mind at once. One, that the nation is founded not on ethnicity but on an ideal. Two, that the nation cannot be perfect but can become at least marginally more perfect. Three, that ethnic nationalism may represent a serious threat to the country as we would wish it to be. But when we stand against the practice, we must do so with a respect for the practitioners. This is hugely important. Lyndon Johnson, in his last public speech in 1973 at the Johnson Library, said, "Nobody is going to do what you want them to do if they think that you think they're dumb or racist or whatever. If they think that, they're going to dig in deeper." Conversion is a tricky business. But remember, conversion requires converts, and converts only come when someone chooses to convert from position A to position B. If everybody were already in position B, then there'd be no reason to talk about conversion. A final word. Civic patriotism is essential for democracy. Ethnic nationalism could be fatal to it. Democracy depends on the daily habits of heart and mind, daily struggles to curb selfishness and appetite and ambition. Because democracy is founded on our seeing one another not as reflexive adversaries, but as neighbors, and to be forever open to the possibility of lending a hand. Not because lending a hand is the right thing to do, though it is, but because democracy thrives when we live in a sense of covenant. We help each other because if circumstances were reversed, and that's what circumstances do, they reverse, we're going to need that help someday. Here's what Harry Truman thought about the tricky nature of democracy. Quote, "The country has to awaken every now and then to the fact that the people are responsible for the government they get. And when they elect a man to the presidency who doesn't take care of the job, they've got nobody to blame but themselves. Nobody to blame but themselves or ourselves." The good news is that hope is not lost. Truman also said this, "The people have often made mistakes, but given time and facts, they'll make the corrections." We may fail. We often have. Democracies do. That's the experience of history. But if we are to survive, our path to a durable future, one of liberty and opportunity, will begin when enough of us look out on the world clearly, honestly, forthrightly. And when we remember that we are a nation forged, as Hamilton wrote, not by force and accident, but by coolness and deliberation. The duty of our time is clear. Act patriotically. And perhaps then we can save our country and render it worth the saving. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I dislike this discipline with the text. There were at least 3 stories that we're going to work in now.
I have a few of our audience questions for you. What are the economic factors that shape civic patriots and ethnic nationalists? In other words, what are the most fundamental differences between how civic patriots and ethnic nationalists perceive the role of the free market in American society?
The second part I'm not sure of. The first part I can say, patriotism is the way to have an arena in which the arguments I've been making prevail, requires prosperity. Because when people are not worried about their existential needs, they are more likely to accept an argument about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Doesn't make a lot of difference to someone to be preached to about parchment when they're feeling poor. And it's no mistake, I think, no coincidence rather, that in 1964 and 65, those years marked one of the highest per capita household income numbers in American history. People like me felt comfortable enough to say, okay, we'll do the right thing. I wish that weren't true. I wish we'd done the right thing, but we didn't. And so one of the causes for nationalist fevers is a sense, and I want to be clear here, it's not always reality, but a sense that people are losing ground. One of the one of the features of the time, of our moment, is that by most measures, this should not be an ethnic nationalist economy, right? Now, there is a disturbing and possibly fatal gap in terms of wealth, unquestionably, and there are policy steps we can take to begin to address that. But what I would argue is that to do so is in harmony with what I think of as the civic patriot view that we all have the right to pursue happiness, so let's make it a little easier. Let's not make it harder. There's one number I remember when I was sort of looking at what happened in 2016, about which I was totally wrong until about 2 a.m. on election night. The Commerce Department has issued reports that suggest that for an American family of 4 to lead what we would think of as a classic post-World War II middle-class life requires $130,000 in household income. Household income is about $74,000. So that $60,000 is one of the numbers that drove the election in 2016. The other is in 1964, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, 72% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing some or most of the time. That number's now about 12, and I want to meet them. And so that gap was also part of that. Without prosperity, without widespread prosperity, the experiment will not work.
It's hard to imagine a scenario like the one with LBJ and Wallace in today's political climate. Do you foresee a time where we will see this cooperation between the parties again?
I wouldn't call that cooperation. I really wouldn't. That was an emergency meeting when the commander-in-chief was trying to convince a governor to keep law and order so that Johnson explicitly did not want to send federal troops in because he said it'll be like Reconstruction all over again. Very, very few greater political talents ever dwelt on earth than Lyndon Johnson. It's part of the tragedy of Vietnam is that he suspended his political instincts for all the sundry reasons. So I don't see that as some sort of Brookings Institution seminar, where all right, let's reform entitlements. I don't see that. I'm a firm believer, because of moments like that the character and dispositions of people in power matter enormously, and we incentivize that, we create that. And so, yeah.
And I think this will be our last question. Which past president, due to skills and temperament, would be best suited, in your opinion, to take this country forward?
We're taped, right? Ann Richards once came into Newsweek to do an interview, and someone said, "Do you want this to be on the record or off the record?" She said, "You boys want to learn anything?" We went off the record. I think that, let me put it this way, save for the actuarial table, Joe Biden is a very good president. And the fact that he is president is a testament, I believe, to an argument that I have made with you and I make elsewhere, which is that at the very last minute, when we've exhausted every other possibility, we managed to do the right thing. And if the popular vote had gone the other way in 2016, I might have had a different view. But I do believe that. And so I think, again, President Biden is my friend. I help him when I can, so all that's stipulated. But I'm not a partisan. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I voted for both parties. I live in Tennessee, so when I say I have conservative friends, that's redundant. But I think we're in very good hands. And I think, again, actuarially, if history and fate had not brought him to the pinnacle at this season in his life, I think he would be good at seeing us forward. He has steadied an uncertain time. And if you come back and say, well, yeah, but look who the Republican nominee is, but that's not his fault, right? And the thing about democracy is you can't love your country only when you win. But he won, offering a very clear sensibility and temperament. That was the question, right? And so I think we owe him an enormous debt. Look, he asked for the job. That's all true. So I'm not suggesting that, we play violins for him, but I am saying that before you surrender hope, the electorate managed to make what I believe to be the right decision 46 months ago. And they may make the wrong decision in, 6 weeks? But I think if enough of us make this case that we are in fact stronger, the more widely we open our arms than when we clench a fist. And that may sound homiletic, but sometimes we need homilies. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.